As you learned the anatomy of the heart, you saw that there were many blood vessels associated with the heart and running to and from the heart and the body. So let's begin a quick look at the difference and some of the characteristics that are in common between all of those blood vessels. So you should have learned already that there are different types of vessels that include the arteries that take blood away from the heart. So you have A for away and A for artery. Silly little memory trick. Large arteries take blood from the heart and flow into smaller and smaller arteries and then into even smaller arterioles. So when you see oles, O-L-E-S, think small. So from the heart into arteries to arterioles. From your arterioles, blood flows into the smallest of vessels, which are the capillaries. So capillaries are the site of exchange between the blood and the tissues that surround the blood vessels. Capillaries are very, very thin, and it's at the capillaries where oxygen and CO2 are exchanged between the blood and the tissues. Nutrients, hormones, waste products, and many other things move between the tissues and the blood. And then your capillaries flow into small venules. Okay, so venules are tiny little veins that receive the blood from the capillaries, and then the blood flows into larger and larger and larger veins. So veins, V-E-I-N, bring blood back in to the heart. So the veins are the largest of the vessels that return the blood back to the heart, that deoxygenated blood getting ready to be pumped out to the lungs from the right side. But you knew all that already. All right, so let's look at the layers of the blood vessels, and we call those layers tunic or tunics. Tunics simply means covering. The inside of the blood vessels, the hollow part where the blood flows, is the central opening we call the lumen. As we look at the layers of the wall, we begin with the deepest layer, which is the tunica intima, sometimes called the tunica interna. It has an endothelial layer that is very, very smooth, that's continuous with the endocardium of the heart. So this very smooth layer in the blood vessels ensures that the blood flows and moves very smoothly and helps to prevent clotting. There's also a layer of simple squamous epithelium, and these two layers together help to reduce the friction. The next layer, the middle layer, is the tunica media. So media, think middle, but also think muscle in the case of these blood vessels. So the tunica media is a sheet of circular arranged smooth muscle cells. Now remember, smooth muscle cells are involuntary muscles, so we can't control their contraction. In addition to the smooth muscle that surrounds these vessels and make up the tunica media, you have sheets of elastin. Again, I'll ask you to remember back to your Anatomy 1 class. Elastin was that fibrous tissue in the connective tissues that we studied that allows for body structures to be stretched and then to move back to their original shape, very much like if you flip your ear, it goes back to its normal shape. Well, the elastin allows the smooth muscle to constrict and then to go back into its normal shape, as well as to expand when blood flows through these vessels. Now, because of these two components together, the sheets of smooth muscle and the elastin, vasoconstriction can occur when those muscles contract, and that narrows the blood vessels, and vasodilation, relaxation, allows for the vessels to become more open, or a larger lumen in that blood vessel. This helps to control blood flow and blood pressure. The outermost layer is the tunica externa, sometimes called the tunica adventitia. So you have a layer of connective tissue that attaches and helps to anchor these blood vessels into the tissue surrounding them. So there's a lot of loosely woven collagen fibers, and your tunica externa, being that most fibrous connective tissue associated with the blood vessels, protects and anchors those vessels. So let's look at the different vessels, the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries, and how these layers or these tunics help to make up their composition. So arteries have the normal tunica intima, a very thick tunica media, and then the normal tunica externa. So you see why it is different here. We've put the word thick here with tunica media. Remember, arteries are taking blood away from the heart, so they have to withstand blood under a lot of pressure. So that thick muscular layer allows those arteries to be much more substantial, to be able to withstand that pressure, but also to have very substantial vasoconstriction when those muscles in the tunica media constrict. And this helps to move blood throughout the body as well as to maintain blood pressure. The capillaries are very, very thin. Remember, I mentioned just a few minutes ago that this is the site of exchange between the blood and the surrounding tissues. So your capillaries are composed simply of a thin layer of tunica intima. In most cases, it's one cell layer thick, so it allows for that very easy diffusion. And your veins have all three layers again: the tunica intima, a thin tunica media, and of course the outer tunica externa. The significance of this is that that thin tunica media does not allow for as much vasoconstriction, but again your veins are receiving blood after it flows through the capillaries, so that blood is under much less pressure than the blood that is found in the arteries. So if we look at an image here showing the difference in these, here we have an artery, a capillary, and a vein. So you can see the tunica externa, remember external or outer layer, really doesn't look that different between the artery and the vein. The tunica media, however, is much thicker in your arteries as compared to your veins, the thinner layer of muscle tissue. And the tunica intima, same old, right? Just a nice smooth layer of tissue, so blood flows through these arteries into smaller arterioles and then into our very thin layer of tunica intima that makes up our capillaries. But of course we have the basement membrane associated with those tissues in the capillary walls. Now once diffusion has occurred across the capillary walls, blood is going to flow into smaller venules and then back into those larger veins. Now notice the arrows are pointing back up, so this is referring to the path of blood flow. Flows down through the arteries, into the arterioles, through the capillary beds, into the venules, and then into the veins that will return that blood back into the heart. I want you to notice, however, this modification here within the lumen of the veins. So this is associated with that tunica intima. These are little flaps, so they're modifications in the tunica intima. The flaps work very much like a swinging door. Blood pushes against the door and it opens. But if the blood is pushed back down, for instance, the muscle tissue that surrounds these veins in the different areas of the body, if the muscle contracts and pushes on these veins, well, the blood might get pushed backwards, but these valves, little flaps, help to prevent that blood from backflowing back into the lower tissues. Very much like if you squeezed a tube of toothpaste and both ends were open, blood would go in both directions. So the valves prevent that backflow. You may hear in your lecture about varicose veins. Varicose veins develop when these valves are insufficient or they are no longer functioning properly, and they allow that tissue or allow that blood to backflow and pool in the tissue. Did you know that hemorrhoids are just varicose veins of the anus? Oh, the things you learn in lab. All right, so arteries, as I mentioned, have the thick muscular wall so that they can withstand all that pressure from the blood as it's pushed from the heart, ejected from those ventricles. The capillaries have that single layer of tissues, so that our single layer of cells, so that things can move easily into and out of the blood. And then the veins have the thinner walls withstanding less pressure and the valves to prevent the backflow. Told you all that already, huh? All right, here in these images you can see what you would see if we were in lab and using the microscope. You can see that the arteries have a much thicker tunica media. So here you have the pink layer. This is your muscle, so very thick, As compared to the vein, you have a thinner, less rigid layer of that muscle. Here you have the tunica externa and tunica externa, and then lining the tissue or lining these vessels, you have a tunica intima. I'm sorry, someone just opened my door and there was a lot of background noise there. Now notice that the vein appears somewhat collapsed as compared to the artery. Remember, the thinner walls of this tunica media allow the veins to appear much more collapsed.